Mrs. Dennison's Head, From Cobwebs from an Empty Skull, by Dod Grile. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. Mrs. Dennison's Head, by Dod Grile. While I was employed in the Bank of Loan and Discount, said Mr. Applegarth, smiling the smile with which he always prefaced a nice old story, there was another clerk there named Dennison, a quiet, reticent fellow, the very soul of truth, and a great favorite with us all. He always wore crape in his hat, and once, when asked for whom he was in mourning, he replied his wife, and seemed very affected. We all expressed our sympathy as delicately as possible, and no more was said upon the subject. Some weeks after this he seemed to have arrived at that stage of tempered grief at which it becomes a relief to give sorrow words, to speak of the departed one to sympathizing friends. For one day he voluntarily began talking of his bereavement, and of the terrible calamity by which his wife had been deprived of her head. This sharpened our curiosity to the keenest edge, but of course we controlled it, hoping he would volunteer some further information with regard to so singular a misfortune. But when day after day went by and he did not allude to the matter, we got worked up into a fever of excitement about it. One evening after Dennison had gone, we held a kind of political meeting about it, at which all possible and impossible methods of decapitation were suggested as the ones to which Mrs. D probably owed her extraordinary demise. I am sorry to add that we so far forgot the grave character of the event as to lay small wagers that it was done this way or that way, that it was accidental or premeditated, that she had a hand in it herself, or that it was wrought by circumstances beyond her control. All was mere conjecture, however, but from that time Dennison, as the custodian of a secret upon which we had staked our cash, was an object of more than usual interest. It wasn't entirely that, either. Aside from our paltry wagers, we felt a consuming curiosity to know the truth for its own sake. Each set himself to work to elicit the dread secret in some way, and the misdirected ingenuity we developed was wonderful. All sorts of pious devices were resorted to entice poor Dennison into clearing up the mystery. By 1,000 indirect methods we sought to entrap him into divulging all. History, fiction, poesy, all were laid under contribution, and from Goliath down through Charles I to Sam Speaker, a local celebrity who got his head entangled in milling machinery, every one who had ever mourned the loss of a head received his due share of attention during office hours. The regularity with which we introduced, and the pernicity with which we stuck to this one topic, came near to getting us all discharged. For one day the cashier came out of his private office and intimated that if we valued our situations, the subject of hanging would afford us the means of retaining them. He added that he always selected his subordinates with an eye to their conversational abilities, but variety of subject was as desirable, at times, as exhaustive treatment. During all this discussion, Dennison, albeit he had evinced from the first a singular interest in the theme, and shirked not his fair share of the conversation, never once seemed to understand that it had any reference to himself. His frank, truthful nature was quite unable to detect the personal significance of the subject. It was plain that nothing short of a definite inquiry would elicit the information we were dying to obtain, and at a caucus one evening we drew lots to determine who should openly propound it. The choice fell on me. The next morning We were at the bank somewhat earlier than usual, waiting impatiently for Dennison and the time to open the doors. They always arrived together. When Dennison stepped into the room, bowing in his engaging manner to each clerk as he passed to his own desk, I confronted him, shaking him warmly by the hand. At that moment all the others fell to writing and figuring with unusual avidity, as if thinking of anything under the sun except Dennison's wife's head. "Oh, Dennison," I began, as carelessly as I could manage it, "speaking of decapitation reminds me of something that I would like to ask you. I have intended to ask it several times, but it has always slipped my memory. Of course you will pardon me if it's not a fair question." As if by magic the scratching of pens died away, leaving a dead silence which quite disconcerted me, but I blundered on. "I heard the other day, that is, you said, or it was in the newspapers, or somewhere, something about your poor wife, you understand? About her losing her head. Would you mind telling me how such a distressing accident, if it were an accident, occurred?" When I finished, Dennison walked straight past me as if he didn't see me, went round the counter to his stool, and perched himself gravely on the top of it, facing the other clerks. Then he began speaking calmly and without apparent emotion. "Gentlemen, I have long desired to speak of this thing, but you gave me no encouragement, and I naturally supposed you were indifferent. I now thank you for all the friendly interest you take in my affairs. I will satisfy your curiosity on this point at once, if you will promise never hereafter to allude to the matter, and to ask not a single question now." We all promised on our sacred honor, and collected about him with the utmost eagerness. He bent his head a moment, then raised it, and quietly said, "My poor wife's head was bitten off." "By what?" we all exclaimed eagerly, with suspended breath. He gave us a look full of reproach, turned to his desk, and went at his work. We went to ours. The End of Mrs. Dennison's Head, by Dod Grile.